Thomas, I think that we can begin if you're ready.
All right, super. Um, Welcome everybody. Sorry for the few minutes delay. So I'm Tomurnat from the International Institute for Sustainable Development, and we have a panel today on fossil-free recovery. So I was asked to quickly introduce the topic and highlight why it is necessary that there is a fossil-free recovery and take a little bit of note of the state of play, where we're at, and what some of the priorities are. So for that, just so you don't need to be looking at my face, I'm going to share just a few slides. And if you can see this, please raise your thumb. That way, okay, that way it works. Good, fossil-free recovery. First, why is it important? I always like to show some graphs. I think it's easy. This, of course, is one of the more shocking graphs that probably all of you know, and this is COVID, right? And I think that's important to put in context that even a year where our supply chains basically got shut down, that we got locked in. This is what we got in terms of emission reductions, right? And why it's important to have fossil-free recovery is in part because it seems to have been pretty bad in recent history at using opportunities. And I think this one is the most important one. If you can see my cursor, of course, this is a 2008-2009 financial crisis. And so when people say that was quite a dirty recovery, they are referring, of course, to what happened afterwards, right? Where we kind of continued, if you want, that very strong growing trend in emissions that we saw already basically since the onset of the latest globalization wave, but even more so in the 2000s. And so that continued, right? And so if we don't break this particular graph, it's going to be very difficult to limit global warming to 1.5 and even 2 degrees Celsius. This is a second graph, why we need a fossil-free recovery. It's something, this is a graph from our friends at the International Energy Agency. I think it's something that many people don't realize, but the current energy infrastructure we have, plus the one that is currently under construction, would already lead to about a 1.65 degrees Celsius warming, right? So a fossil-free recovery is not only needed to basically add new infrastructure that is a bit more green, more clean, but also in part to adjust the problem that we have today, because with our current infrastructure, we're already on the path to global warming above 1.5 degrees Celsius. And then the third reason is, of course, investment, right? Public investment, recovery packages are needed to kind of unlock, and there I wrote not unlock, but unleash private investment in key sectors, right? So here, the only thing that you kind of need to look at is the difference, if you want, between where we are in the energy sector, which is about 2 trillion of investment every year, and where we would need to be annually between 2000, basically today, and 2030, in the next decade. We need to be around 5.7 trillion if we want to be on a path for net zero, right? And we're very far away from that. We're definitely not even, this is sort of the expected trends of annual averages. But today we're much more around 2 trillion USD. So we really need an amplification, if you want, of private investment, and public money is needed to kind of show private investors the way. Second part, what is the state of the recovery? Well, very simple. It's mixed, but it's definitely insufficient, right? And if we see where we're at right now, so as you know, we ISD, together with a number of other organizations, have a bottom-up energy policy tracker. And so this is the latest, if you want, the latest spot picture, particularly of the G20, these numbers, where we see that around, more than 300 billion is supporting fossil fuel energy, and a little less than 300 billion is supporting clean energy. So it's quite balanced. Of course, balance is not at all what we need, right? And if we look at sort of the evolution over time, so this is USD billion, right? And so this is since basically COVID hit around January, February, March 2020. If we look at it over time, we see this nice trend that, of course, clean energy investments have become more pronounced, or there has been more commitments later in the day. And of course, with the EU package coming in, with the infrastructure bill in the United States as well, we're expecting this to grow even more. But where we are today, in October 2021 latest, is definitely still something mixed. And if you translate that from billions into sort of percentage of funding going to either fossil fuels or to cleaner source of energy, we see sort of a convergence over time, right? But what we really want to see is basically those green lines to go up and the fossil line go down, right? One of the bigger missed opportunities that we think is this fossil fuel funding. Most of it has been unconditional, right? So more than 80% of basically funds used to bail out or to support more fossil energy sectors. So this includes airports, this includes automobile manufacturers, if it is conventional automobiles that they produce. It has been without any sort of environmental conditions attached, right? And so while in this early stage of the pandemic, a lot of those bailouts were, of course, linked to social policies as well, right? Especially maintaining jobs. Unfortunately, we have seen that type of bailout funding come without any environmental conditions attached. And that is a sort of a big missed opportunity, and quite frankly, potentially money that won't buy itself back, if you want. And then the last one, a little bit about priorities, and my colleagues will talk a bit more about that as well. The first priority, of course, is good to know what our priorities are, right? And both the International Energy Agency, the International Renewable Energy Agency, and various experts, both academically and practitioner, highlight sort of 2 decades of priorities, with this decade really needing a radical transformation of the power sector, right? And we see that very clearly here with added renewables, right? Next decade, where carbon emission reductions, because this graph specifically is about carbon emission reductions, next decade, this would come then from further electrification of our activities, in particular transport, right? So transport sector decarbonization. So this is really the decade where we see further exponential growth, ideally of electric vehicles, and we will also need to start implementing solutions for heavier transport, for which we don't yet have alternatives, trucking, shipping, and aviation especially. So these are clearly the priorities for the next 2 decades. And what this means in terms of technology and installation, right, is really a huge sort of increase, a huge, amplification of what we have today, which is definitely not easy. If you look at capacity additions that we would like to see annually by 2030, we are going from 210 to more than 1 terawatt, which is of course quite substantial. Electric car sales need to up to more than 50 million. Energy intensity of GDP needs to go down as well. So these are serious things to do, all within one particular decade to stay on track for net zero, right? And then the final thing, again, when we link public money, it is not just public financing in terms of subsidies. It is also meant, of course, to direct private investors, right? And so there we see this is a sustainable development scenario of the International Energy Agency, right? There we see some serious differences between where we need to be and where we are today, and this I think already shows something about respective priorities, right? In those 3 sectors, within fuels, we need to gradually see less investment. We have, of course, seen a dip in investment in fuels because of COVID. This was the exact same thing as we saw in 2014, 2015, when the price crashed, mainly 2015. But at this time, we see a lot of conversation, of course, about increasing capital expenditure, exactly to deal with those high energy prices, right? So this is a trend that is definitely not safe. In terms of the power sector, we see sort of great investments happening. At the same time, they are just simply insufficient, specifically in terms of both renewables, but also storage, networks. So transmission lines and distribution, but especially transmission, which is key for having a higher penetration rate of renewable energy, right? And then in end-use sectors, I think already for the last couple of years before COVID, we actually saw stagnation in terms of public investments in energy efficiency. And we see that is quite a big problem, right? So we need almost to double, if you want, our investment in energy efficiency. And this is often something that the government can play a key role in through what I call green Keynesianism. I think it's time to recognize that free markets are not going to solve this on their own. I'm pretty sure nobody on this call thinks that they would. But so that is why, of course, we need fossil-free recovery policies. And I'll stop right here and happily pass the word to the next speaker. Thank you.
Thanks, Tom. That was a really great overarching overview of what is needed for a fossil-free recovery. I think we didn't get a chance to thank everyone for joining us today in this session. We have an excellent sort of panel of speakers that have been working on fossil-free recovery. So the next speaker is Lourdes Sanchez. She's a senior policy advisor and a lead for Indonesia at IIST. So maybe we can get some thoughts from you, Lourdes, on sort of what are some overarching guidelines for a fossil-free recovery. Over to you.
Yes, thank you very much, Sid, and thank you very much, Tom, also, and to the organizer of this session. I guess you can see my screen properly, or should I? Is in the presentation modus?
No, it's not currently on the presenter mode, so maybe you could just switch that on.
Okay. See, I guess now.
Yeah.
Okay, perfect. Thank you. So yeah, again, thanks a lot, everyone. I mean, what I'm going to be talking actually about is how actually to do what Tom has shared in terms of what is needed for the fossil-free recovery, but how to put that in practice through policy. So is the policy view of that. And that collects basically IISD's recommendations on how to achieve this fossil-free recovery. So just, I mean, like very briefly, I mean, what is fossil-free recovery for us? So I think Tom already kind of hinted what, the needs of that, but basically it's a recovery that boosts the economy and at the same time promotes or accelerates the move to clean energy for all, while at the same time it takes steps towards a just transition away from fossil fuels. So the way we have put that in place is actually through this scheme that you see here. So it's like 5 steps. And again, very focused on policy, what kind of policies should be implemented or can be implemented in order to achieve this fossil-free recovery. Of course, with the aim to arrive to the SDGs first by 2030, but looking forward to the net zero by 2050 or the dates that other countries have. So the first of these principles is actually stop providing public money to fossil fuel production. I don't think I have to say much after the excellent presentation by Tom, but I will show a couple of additional numbers. Then the second step is actually, instead of subsidizing fossil fuels, like reform these subsidies and use fossil fuels as a way to raise public money to work on the energy transition. And that's the second step, both by the reform of subsidies to fossil fuels, but also taxing them. Then we'll see in detail how much we can raise and what are, the fossil fuels that will be more sensible to raise money from, and this money swap it to promote the clean energy in general from a public perspective. Then a further step is actually to also use public money, but also develop the right policies and incentives to promote investment in clean energy, private investment mostly. And the last one is do all this under the just transition logic to make sure that no one is left behind. So I'm going to explain briefly each of the principles, or a little bit at least about them, giving some examples of what other countries have already done in that aspect. So first, stop providing public money to fossil fuel production. Again, Tom has shared the numbers of what is needed, but also where public support for COVID-19 recovery has gone so far in the energy sector. So this comes on top of that, at least before 2019, because this is the value of subsidies that were anyway granted to the energy sector, as well as other support measures, like, for example, state-owned enterprise investment and public finance. So I think the key message here anyway is like this is additional money to the COVID-19 recovery packages, but also that's the amount that is received by fossil fuels is much bigger than other types of energy and of course than clean energy. So this definitely needs to change. And just a little zoom to the fossil fuel subsidies, we see that, well, so far, I mean, last year, the values were, the 2020 values are the latest that we have, and it was around $375 billion US. Normally, yeah, they oscillate between 500 billion and a few, 300, depending on a lot on the price of consumer fuels, because, you know, most of the estimated values are consumer. But the thing is, most of the producer subsidies are still not estimated. So that's also an issue that we should consider when looking at recovery. And the second of our principles is raise money from fossil fuel subsidies and fossil subsidy reform and taxation. I mean, this might sound a bit controversial because obviously these measures imply price increases, and we are talking about recovery. The economy is not in the best situation right now in order to raise prices. But there are two things. So first, we know there's a lot of research that tells us that actually fossil fuel subsidies, they are not a good social policy. So they actually benefit those that, the rich more than the poor. And another big factor is actually the current price of fossil fuels does not consider the externalities. That means the real cost to society, both when it comes in terms of social aspects, but also, well, environmental and health. That's a very important point also. So that's why reforming subsidies to some fuels and adding an additional tax to reflect this externality cost can have more positive benefits than negative. So at the same time, we know fossil fuels, it's a very broad area. And here what we're recommending actually is reforming subsidies to gasoline and diesel for transportation and also to coal for power generation. And same thing, apply tax to these fuels. If we do that globally, we can raise over $550 billion US globally a year. And of course, this is a very important amount of money that can be raised in the energy transition, but also for the post-pandemic recovery. So the next principle is swap this support from fossil fuels to clean energy and also use the additional funding that is raised via tax. By the way, I forgot to say that some countries have already undertaken measures like that. Like, for example, India, during the pandemic, they implemented an additional tax to transport fuels, and Costa Rica, and both they use this money for COVID-19 recovery. So it's not something completely strange, or some countries at least they have already undertaken those measures. And again, what can we do with this additional money? So we have seen that actually a lot of countries have started supporting the energy transition via infrastructure for more renewables, electric vehicles infrastructure as well, energy efficiency, a very important point, but also not to forget energy access. And actually we saw, for example, some African countries that during the pandemic, they actually incentivized the move towards clean energy in order to support the energy access. That was, for example, Burkina Faso and Nigeria, they have related programs. Another important point, and actually that's getting back to what Tom was already saying, is like the importance of private investments, not only public, of course, but also private. And even if, because again, electrification is going to be the key in the energy transition. And even if the cost of renewables has decreased dramatically over the past few years, there is still a lot of hurdles. So that's why the government has a very important role there to play in order to de-risk and also incentivize and leverage private investment. So make sure that the private sector private investors, they found an easy path there. And there are three main ways to do that. So first is through subsidies and other supporting policies to promote investment in renewables. Also mandate public finance institutions to address country-specific risks. And the last thing is also work together with the state-owned enterprises so that they become leads in the transition away from fossil fuels. And the last point is, of course, the ensuring the just transition. So this is an overarching one, and it's to make sure that no one is left behind, because we know that all these changes, they're going to have important impacts on people, communities, and whole sectors. So it's very important that governments work together with workers, with employers, but also with the stakeholders, like, for example, energy consumers and communities, so that everybody is included in this transition and the needs of these different communities or groups are considered. And this is it from my end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Lourdes. I think you've given us lots to talk about, and we'll definitely come back to it in the Q&A session. Can I just request members of the audience, if you have any questions, please put it in the chat box along with your name and organization. So Anissa, maybe we can turn to you now for some reflections on Indonesia's perspective.
Okay, thank you, Sudhar. I'll share my screen now. Okay, is everyone seeing my screen okay? Okay, my name is Anissa Swarsono. I'm an energy policy associate with ISD. I'm based in Jakarta, Indonesia. So just following up with Tom and Lourdes' presentation on the importance of fossil-free recovery or the green recovery, I'm going to talk about why Indonesia specifically needs a fossil-free recovery. So to just giving a little bit of a context on Indonesia's current situation. So this chart here, it shows Indonesia's energy mix. And as you can see, this one is from 2019, the latest figure we have. The majority of Indonesia's energy supply, it comes from oil and coal. Oil mostly supplies the transportation sector, while coal goes to various sectors for electricity. So long story short, it's a country that has a very high dependency on fossil fuel, especially on coal. And now if we want to zoom in on the electricity sector specifically, this chart here shows the current installed capacity in Indonesia. As for 2020, we have about 61 gigawatt of installed capacity. And as you can see here, only about 12-13% of it comes from renewable energy, mostly from hydro and geothermal. And even for other types of renewable energy like wind and solar, it doesn't even account. And as you can see, for electricity, it's also in 2018, Indonesia was named as like the 8th largest greenhouse gas emitter in the world. And as you can see from this chart, the largest emission contribution is from forestry and land use. That's the one in orange. And the second one is from the energy sector. That's the one in blue. And although we see like quite a drop of emission number from 2015, if we take a closer look into the energy sector, the amount has been steadily increasing since 2014. So coming back to the original topic, why does Indonesia need green recovery? Well, just to reiterate some stuff that both Tom and Lourdes have explained very well, this is a time where we have to change. And the key to that is that the recovery packages needs to be aligned with the climate targets. So the G20 countries have all agreed that the money to put all the money to mitigate change in the recovery budgets and to ensure that financial flows are consistent with the carbon emission pathway. As the new president of the G20 just starting this year, so the country kind of has a responsibility domestically. And recovery packages here, in this case, it presents a very unique opportunity to align the economic and social recovery with climate action. So continuing to pour support into fossil fuel is contradictory to the outcomes of the G7 summit, which is to stop funding coal, free to work from fossil fuel dependency, and further mobilize climate finance for developing countries, especially like Indonesia. So what is Indonesia's own climate ambition? So Indonesia has a target to reduce their emission by 29% unconditionally and 41% conditionally by 2030 against the business as usual scenario. There is also the pledge to make UN renewable energy share 23% of the primary energy mix by 2025. And also earlier this year, the government, the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources, together with PLN, which is the state-owned company that deals with electricity, they have published a strategy for the power and utility sector to achieve net zero in either 2045, 2050, or 2060 latest. So there's like 3 scenarios considered in that strategy. Now, if we take the moderate scenario, which is to reach net zero by 2050, this is the roadmap of the power and utility sector to achieve Indonesia's carbon neutrality by that is probably, as I mentioned earlier, there's the 23% target by 2025. And then by 2030, we're planning to development and also starting to phase out the older coal power plant. And then the ultimate, very ambitious target is to have 99.5% of new and renewable energy on the grid by 2050 or 2060 at the latest. And if you look at the highlighted part down below, it is estimated that it's going to take 40 trillion, okay, that's about 2.7 billion USD to completely phase out fossil fuel source power plants by 2050. So that's quite a lot of money to be raised. Now, as Tom and Dolores both mentioned earlier in their presentation, since 2020, and the ISD, together with several other organizations, have started tracking the recovery budgets from various countries to see how much of the recovery budget are being poured into the energy sector, and how much of it went to fossil fuel, and how much of it went to clean energy. Now, in Indonesia's case, Indonesia committed in 2020. Indonesia committed at least 6.78 billion US dollar to support different over at least 96.5% of it goes to fossil fuel. This is from various new direct transfer funds to fossil fuel related state-owned enterprises. And although there are also some incentives that goes into the renewable energy sectors, but stations, pushbacks on commercial operation dates, etc. So none of them can actually be quantified. And judging from how the speed of renewable energy development in Indonesia in the past few years, we're still so far from target that the renewable energy sector is working either. It's not very effective. So from what is seen now,
I think there's
what's
some
already
issue.
done,
Sorry,
the
I think there's some
recovery
issue
fund,
with your network. Is it possible to maybe turn off the video?
okay.
Yeah, please go ahead.
So from what is seen now and what's the recovery fund in Indonesia is not yet in line with Indonesia's climate ambition, which is to speed up the renewable energy share 23% by 2025, to add to the grid within the next 10 years, and to completely phase out coal from the electricity sector by 2060 the latest. So is it still possible for Indonesia to redirect their public funds? So the explanation on that part, that will be continued by my colleague Betty. So I'm going to head it over to the next speaker.
Great. Thank you so much, Anissa. I think, definitely it gave a lot of, it sort of reflected a lot of the conversations that are taking place in India as well. And it's quite heartening to see some of the ambitions from the state-owned enterprises. Now, Betty, could I turn to you for maybe 5 minutes of high-level comments?
Yeah, sure. Okay, can you see my presentation? Okay, great. Thank you so much, Sid, and thank you, Anissa, for starting the ideas or some backgrounds on Indonesia. So I'm going to speak on examples what Indonesia have done in terms of dealing with the recovery in Indonesia in the energy sector. So this is the last slide from Anissa. So we already listened to Anissa explanation earlier that Indonesia is like more giving money to fossil fuel sectors, and as well as the recovery budget in Indonesia in 2020, most of the money going to the energy sector is going to the fossil fuel energy sector. So it's not green enough. This recovery budget in Indonesia is not green enough, and the idea is it's going to be great if Indonesia could have a greener recovery budget. However, at this moment, the government already planned to actually stop the recovery only until 2023. So the government actually have options to make a greener on their state budget. So it's an option for the government to actually start looking at the greener allocation in the state budget. So how do they do that? So far, the second principle that Lourdes already mentioned was raising money from fossil fuel subsidy reform and taxes. And Indonesia currently has approved the carbon tax carbon tax in this year to be implemented in April 2022, and it's going to be initially implemented for coal-fired power plants. And this carbon tax revenue, the idea is to use this money to actually fund the climate mitigation and climate adaptation in Indonesia. What they can do further, apart from actually just implement this carbon tax, they can actually add some more taxes, modest taxes on the transport fuels and coal. And then they also can reform the transport fuel subsidies and also the coal subsidies. What they can do from the revenue, as Lourdes also mentioned, that when you add these taxes and you remove the subsidies, that will lead into energy prices, energy prices increases. So what happened is that the government can use this revenue for the social protection program to protect the poor and vulnerable people or community that affected by these energy prices increases. And also they can also use this for renewable energy development. So the other thing that they can do is to swap the subsidy from fossil fuel to cleaner energy. So in 2015, Indonesia already did this before. They actually swapping this 211 trillion rupiah, and this was swapped into infrastructure and the social program in Indonesia in 2015. So Indonesia can also swap these subsidies from fossil fuel to clean energy to achieve the green recovery in the country. And then another thing that the government can also do is incentivizing the investment in the renewable energy sector. They actually have given several incentives in terms of fiscal incentives and the direct transfer. However, these fiscal incentives that they have right now are not very attractive for the renewable energy developers. You can see here there are tax allowances, credit facilities, and tax holidays. All these have these requirements for the renewable energy developers to actually eligible to get these incentives to receive these to claim these incentives to the government. So this has become a barrier for the renewable energy developer because not all of them having this investment value, certain investment value to let's say to claim the tax holiday, the 100% discount on corporate income tax. So the government, what they can do is to improve the regulation for these fiscal incentives. And then the direct transfer, the government already started this, let's say, raising the money for this climate mitigation and climate adaptation from, we call it green sukuk. However, the money for the green sukuk, they have the details on how much is going to the renewable energy infrastructure, but they don't give any details, or there's no details, there's no transparency there, which projects that are actually being financed by this green sukuk. And then there's also international funding that is actually distributed through the SOE, state-owned enterprises. And we have this PTSMI, Sarana Multi-Infrastructure. So they have this international funding going to the government, and the PTSMI is the one who actually distributes to this, let's say, renewable energy developer, or for example, geothermal energy developer. So this international funding actually being distributed through these SOEs. And then the government actually also, before they had this budget, straight to the regional, provincial budget, we call it like special funding for small scale energy. But now they don't have it anymore. In 2019, it was stopped, and they actually just, let's say, allocate budget to the energy sector through the ministerial level. So these cannot be identified how much money going to the renewable energy and how much money going to the fossil fuel. So they are all like in a, let's say, in a bunch of money, and they don't give details or any information how much is going to clean energy and how much is going to fossil fuel. So what they can do in here is to improve transparency on this mechanism and to improve the transparency on the financial flow, because that could help the government or the country to gain more trust from the investor or even from the funders internationally. And finally, there is some efforts that government have already done here. They're actually prioritizing expanding the energy access for the society and also maintaining the affordable energy prices in Indonesia. And the second thing that they have done is that they already formed renewable energy skills development in the country to train some workers. The first, I think what they have done is training the workers from the Ministry of Energy and Mineral Resources from the Energy Ministry for this renewable energy sector training. So instead of just, let's say, looking at this as in, for now, like as in specific to the ministerial level, what they can do is actually try to expand that by, let's say, by giving that responsibilities to those fossil fuel companies who get the support. For example, the government actually provide support to this fossil fuel company, for example, the oil and gas company, state-owned enterprises, for example, and they have to give it to them in a way that if they cannot avoid that support to be given to them, they have to, let's say, they have to oblige this oil and gas company to actually give training to the workers into, like, to prepare them to transition to the cleaner, to transition, let's say, to understand better about this renewable energy sector. So when they're transitioning into, let's say, renewable energy, they can actually have, they already have this knowledge. So it will be making this transition process smoother. And then also, again, going back to the revenue being raised earlier, the government should also ensure that those impacted by the energy transition is well protected by probably increasing the social protection program by giving like well-targeted subsidies. So I think that's some examples from Indonesia. So thank you very much. Looking forward to hearing your questions. Back to you, Sid.
Thanks a lot, Betty. That was really great. I think now maybe we can open it up for any questions. If participants have any questions for our speakers. We also wanted to do sort of have a two-way conversation, so make it into a workshop format and get feedback from different participants on whether the discussions today, does this align with your understanding of a green recovery, and if you see any challenges in the proposed approach. If any participants would like to sort of weigh in on this subject, please go ahead.
Yeah, hi, it's Oliver here, Oliver Greenfield. I guess across the theme of this whole week has been how logical many of these recovery interventions are. And yet they are similarly seem to be striking walls of not being adopted, not being acted on, not being changed. I guess we've seen over and over again across this week diagnosis of the situation and diagnosis of the solutions, but no real diagnosis of the lack of appetite for policymakers to really take these solutions forward. So I don't know whether you've reflected a bit more on what is the barrier for this logic to emerge into policy?
Yeah, that's a great question. Maybe I can direct it to either Tom or Lourdes. Would you like to sort of come in on this point first?
I can go first, and I think also it would be interesting to hear from the Indonesia team. Actually, I think that affects everyone to see also from their end what are kind of the missing opportunities still. So basically, it's, I mean, political will has a very strong element there, of course, and of course, well, we're talking about policy. It's not something that actually changes overnight. So processes require time and. Also, in many cases, actually, we work a lot with policymakers and building capacity on the topic as well, because there's still a lot of misconceptions, like, for example, about the price of renewables, that is still very high, that it's going to be very costly, etc. Or, for example, the impacts of fossil fuel subsidy reform or taxation, which obviously, imply price increases for consumers. That is not the easiest thing to do. And indeed, in the past, there have been a lot of, unfortunately, we've heard of cases of countries that raised prices or reform subsidies to fossil fuels, for example, and that triggered like important, let's say, reactions from the population. So again, here there is something to do. So there are ways, there are processes. We have actually worked with several countries, for example, in West Africa, well, in Africa in general and other parts of the world, where we just have accompanied governments to develop communications plan, also understanding who will be the losers, the winners of reform, so that detailed or specific plans can be deployed, so that the groups that are going to be most vulnerable or suffering from price increases, they can be compensated in a different way. So all to say, so this. I think one of to summarize, so probably one of the things that is stopping further development in this aspect is the fear that this thing can be negative, for the society. But there are ways to implement these changes in a way that, they don't affect the way that they think it could affect the poor and vulnerable. And I don't know if my colleagues also have something to say.
To me, Lourdes is hitting the nail on the head, especially related to any austerity measures in terms of increasing energy prices and so forth. So, linking social mitigation strategies to some of these type of reforms, right? It's quite interesting, actually, because when you look at the literature, the experience around inequality, you see very little impacts of that on actual social and political instability. You see it much more with when food and energy prices increase, right? And obviously food prices are linked to energy prices as well. So there's that. On the other end, I would say for sort of the positive investments, renewables, transmission, batteries, I don't think there's necessarily opposition there. It's just not enough, right? We're actually seeing very good investment ongoing in renewables. As most of you probably know, they completely outcompeted any other sort of energy stocks, if you want, in recent years. It's just that the scale needs to be higher, right? And so there, I think some financial instruments making things easier for particular investors, and even some type of if you look at the United States, they're discussing now a lot about investment production tax credits. These type of things can definitely help.
Thanks, Tom. Betty, Anissa, would you like to weigh in on this as well?
Yeah, okay. So I would just add some. I'm sorry, I cannot turn my video on because I think my bandwidth is not so good. Just weighing in about the Indonesia point of view, I think Lourdes mentioned something about political will. I'm just going to say something about that. I think just to come back to my presentation about how Indonesia is a country that has very high dependency on fossil fuel, how the electricity system is very dependent on coal. So when it comes to designing the recovery package, there is quite, I think it's quite a short-sighted view, like the government just wants to focus on the most vital sector. So they need the coal industry to survive because that's how we get electricity. They need the oil and gas industry to survive because it contributes quite a lot to our GDP. So when it comes to them considering what are the critical sectors that they need to focus on when they design the recovery package, that might be the logic behind it. And even Betty and I had like a recent conversation with the official from the Ministry of Finance. They themselves admit that they know very well that the recovery package that they have designed from 2020 up to 2022 is not green whatsoever. But then that is what they seem to be important or critical sector to focus on. So that's just some additional for me.
Thanks, Anissa. Betty, would you like to comment, or is that?
No, I think that's okay.
Please
I mean, Anissa has already covered. Yeah.
Okay, great. Sandra, I noticed that you had unmuted yourself. So would you like to comment? And then maybe Najma.
Oh, sorry. I just wanted to ask a question about green recovery and fossil fuel policies in cities. I'm based in Germany, and we've seen here some, local initiatives, and people try to do bike lanes and really get into more trying to do something on a local level. Can that also be something, even if these national policies are not yet in place, that cities and subnational entities can kind of like go ahead and lead the way?
Thanks for that. I open it up to any of the speakers to respond.
I can perhaps.
I think
oh, sorry. Go ahead.
No. You go first. I'll just give an example from Indonesia.
Okay. I think most definitely right. And the one thing I was thinking about, just also an example, was around COP. You had the Electric Vehicles Day, and you had this sort of commitment to in all sort of major areas, if you want, to try to electrify 100% of passenger transport, passenger car sales, whether it is cars or vans, by 2035. And a notable absentee, well, obviously Germany and so forth, but was also the United States as a big car manufacturer. But then if you look at the list of signatories to that commitment, you had Washington State, California, New York, and you had 11 of the biggest cities in the United States. So I think it's very clear that when you don't have national action, that subnationally and at the city level, there's a whole lot that can be done.
Please go ahead, Betty.
Yeah, just to add to Tom, Anissa, please add if you have any more information on this. So like in Indonesia, the governor of Bali, actually they have this regulation on the clean energy and EV, just what Tom said also about the EV. So they actually have this implemented, I think in 2019, and it's already implemented there in Bali, and it's actually encouraged the more people to actually use and let's say install more clean energy in their household. Maybe Anissa have more example on this.
Not from top of my mind, actually. So
great, thanks for that. Najma, please go ahead.
Thanks so much, Siddharth. And just a very big thank you from my side to the team that did the presentations. I thought they were excellent and so much to digest and think about. So I'm with the Green Economy Coalition and based out of South Africa. So you can imagine how I find it of personal interest that fossil fuel free recovery actually takes place in my country. I think just three reflections. I think prior to working with the GEC, I was actually working on just transitions with the ILO, and I remember being in a room once with 12 countries discussing nationally determined contributions and fossil fuel subsidy reductions and reform. And it's a very, very tough discussion for many countries to have. We had countries who had over 90%, I shall not mention names, of their GDP coming from fossil fuels. And some countries were just struggling with energy access and couldn't access finance. So I think the energy transition is at the core of this big green recovery and transition that we have to make. And if we have to get it right anyway, we've got to get it right here. So I would, put down three appeals, just at this idea of a just transition and a process to allay fears within industry, within society, has really got to be at the forefront of this transition work. I mean, I do think that we've got to perhaps balance that fear of change with the fear of inaction. We've got to show that, that if we don't actually, and we don't even have to look too far in the future to see already the impacts of not taking action, on the doorsteps and in the experience of so many people already. So just that we frame this entire, and also not at a national level, but we take this idea of a just transition at a global level, because an energy transition is not always just a national, decision. I do want to I was in a conversation recently with facilitated by the Africa Europe Foundation, and it was all about the energy transition in Africa. And I was quite struck by the anger and the frustration of many African governments who are absolutely struggling with access to energy, and ask the question, if we to receive support and incentives to transition to a clean energy, where's the money going to come from? Because the money is not there. And so I'd love really comments and ideas I wanted to share with you, because it's been an issue I've been working on for a while, and it's just been struck how challenging, the scale of action that we need to undertake really is at the country level.
Great. Thank you so much for those reflections. I'm not sure, do any of the panelists want to respond to any of these points?
I can make some remarks, and then if someone else, probably Tom, because you have also worked a lot in Africa, I think. So, again, Africa is just so diverse that just thinking on that, trying to give recommendations for the whole continent, I think it's very complicated. But I can tell you, for example, West Africa, where we had a project for several years with different countries there. And then, of course, it's very complicated, to kind of really, very complicated. You really need to understand what is the actual situation of the country. But one of the things, actually, for example, they have very inefficient subsidies to electricity or fossil fuels in general. That is basically they have big issues with people that don't pay for the connection. Energy access, of course, is a big issue. And tariffs that are defined well below the cost of actually producing electricity. There's also the example in several cases that, for example, that they use, for example, diesel as a backup option, because the way that their, for example, hydro power plants have been designed is not sufficient. It's not sufficient to feed with electricity to the population. And diesel, the problem it has is it depends on the international oil markets, high volatile price, and very expensive way of producing electricity. So I think the way is first to look at where are the inefficiencies and try to sort them out, because I think at least in the countries where we've worked, there's a lot of potential just there by reforming subsidies, because in the end that's what it leads to, and setting the right price, and at the same time the right supporting mechanisms for those that cannot afford to pay for the full price. So that's something definitely not to forget. And then what else? International finance. At this COP, I think there was, there were so many initiatives, at least in different parts of the world, where international organizations, multilateral development banks, etc., they are actually giving support. And then, also we know that they had a trend to support more fossil fuels, but now they're really moving towards focusing more on renewables. China also made the announcement that no more international finance for coal power plants. So there as well, there's a big opportunity to kind of redirect the public funding, or international funding in this case, in the right direction. And of course, again, focus on what is the best solution for each problem. For example, rural electrification. Is it worth really developing the grid, or is it better to have microgrids or mini grids, or decentralized electricity systems based on renewables? So I think that there are many things there, just need to be considering the local circumstances.
Great. Thanks a lot, Lourdes. So just given the time constraint, we won't have time for additional questions. I think thank you everyone for joining us today. Just in summary, we discussed the need for a fossil-free recovery and sort of guidelines for what it should look like. We also touched upon sort of what is needed in Indonesia. The panelists, I think, underlined that the decisions taken today will be critical in the upcoming years to achieve the global climate ambitions and to avoid being locked into sort of fossil fuel infrastructure. The main takeaway that we want sort of you to leave with is that a fossil-free recovery is possible, and countries need to demonstrate ambition towards achieving it. So thank you to all of the speakers for sharing their valuable insights, and to all of the participants. You can continue to follow ISD's research by subscribing to our newsletter, and we hope to organize more sessions like this in the future. Thank you.